President Trump and Xi Jinping, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, cornered Iran in a way I don't think anyone in the European Union expected. And a lot of this has to do with a combination of foreign policy directives from the Trump administration and the Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Xi Jinping. But also at the heart of it, it's all about energy infrastructure and control of that energy infrastructure. Stay tuned. This episode, we're going to unpack this. We're going to look at some of the things that are happening in Canada as well, but also mainly centering around the Gulf states, and look at how China's Belt and Road Initiative is actually generating a long term revenue opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party, even in a declining state. Stay tuned. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to like, subscribe. It really helps us in the algorithm. Your support goes a long way in keeping this podcast going. To unpack this, this past week, Trump went to China mainly to discuss, well, what we saw in the news. It was two things. I think there's what we saw in the news, and the surface level. He mainly went to China more so to discuss the combination of trade opportunities, but also more fundamentally to discuss the Strait of Hormuz. For those of you listening, I mean, it's been all over the news, so you might have heard something along the lines of, there was an Iranian blockade, and Trump put his own blockade, and the Iranians pulled back, blamed the Americans. There have been attacks from Iranian proxies, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, both on Israel and neighboring Gulf states as well. That was a bit surprising. There was a statistic that said that the UAE had been hit more times than Israel. This comes directly from one of their ministers. I can attach the link. I spoke more about this in depth in one of my articles. But there's something deeper going on here, and and I've spoken a lot of this for those of you that follow my newsletter. I talk a lot about this, but there's sort of a reshaping in the Gulf states are undergoing a major reshoring transition, and this comes at the helm of, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The Iranians, the Strait of Hormuz is for them now, on the surface level, becomes more about saving face in the midst of this ongoing conflict. The Americans, it's kind of a Mexican standoff for lack of better terms. Both sides don't want to back down, waiting for the next person, waiting for both sides to fire the first shot. And when the other side fires the first shot, they fire as well, and it goes back and forth. But there's something behind the scenes as well. And this is something that China has been planning for years. For those of you unfamiliar with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative officially launched in 2013. Um, but essentially, it's China's long term strategy to control the supply chain. And they've done very well at this, ensuring that they control a vast majority of rare earth elements and critical minerals. You can tune into my prior podcast episode where I unpacked this. But then this kind of begs the question, what do the Iranians and the Chinese have in common? What do they both have that if there's almost like a mutual interest? Essentially, you have a fascist communist state, run state that's dealing with a radical Islamic regime. They're both polar opposites on every area of the political spectrum, even the value spectrum of what I mean. One's fundamentalist, one's political authoritarian, and again, this brings the question, not to get political, but this brings the question is, what benefit do they serve mutually? What benefit do they have between each other that there's a mutual benefit in their cooperation? And again, this not so the benefit in all that becomes, boils down to one word, and it's oil and gas sector. Iran has, as we know, has vast reserves of natural gas, oil. Effectively they could supply the Gulf. And actually a fun fact. I was watching a video the other day, and um, I didn't look into this, but it was something that kind of got me thinking. Um, but someone in a video had mentioned, that, and it makes sense that Iran has sanctions, and so companies are not allowed to sell them oil. So they have to carry fuel, they have to carry the jet fuel when they fly commercial flights to countries that have sanctions on them. But what's crazy, there's two questions I didn't understand. I don't understand why, if there's sanctions, they're allowing commercial planes, but nonetheless, the other funny part about this whole thing, about that whole scenario, is oil is so cheap for them. The jet fuel is so cheap for them that they don't have to them, even if if it's not as fuel efficient to fly with all their oil for their return flight and their cargo, it's not necessarily uneconomical for them. So that was a bit of a digression, but back to the Belt and Road Initiative. The What's interesting about the Belt and Road Initiative is for years no one really paid attention to this. And I think there's an element of until the Strait of Hormuz was blocked, this is the first time in history it's been blocked. If you look at the IMF Port Watch, say, initiative that the IMF has worked on with Cambridge University to essentially create a centralized um, database for shipping calls and transit calls in major choke points and maritime routes. And it has data on the choke points, specifically the Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, etc. But if you look in Bab el Mandeb even, which is actually an interesting for another discussion, but it's effectively flatline. Shipping calls were down over 90%. Transit calls even, and again, this is effectively, and why this is important is, 20% of the global oil trade flows through that strait, and on the flip side of it as well, more than half of what travels through that waterway through the Strait of Hormuz is the most concentrated global oil, or one of the most concentrated global choke points for oil for the energy sector. If something happens there, I mean, that's of course why we're seeing oil being priced at over $100, something that I bet I didn't really think I would see. Before this happened, I didn't expect that at all. I mean, as soon as I only expect, I guess it's reasonable to assume that after the initial bombing of Iran, but before the U.S. and the Israelis bombed Iran, I didn't think it was possible to. I didn't think of $100 oil unless something again, and that was because unless something crazy like that happened. In a certain sense of the matter, if the Iranians are unable to move their shadow fleets through the Strait of Hormuz, they need to look for an alternative, and the only alternative for them is land routes. They share a border with the Caspian Sea. They share a border with Turkey. The Caspian Sea is key. Through the Caspian Sea, they can effectively reach Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia. That's all fair. I mean, for years they've had this, but the Chinese have been working on rail routes for years. And I guess you never really heard about them. You heard about them occasionally, how the Chinese getting their rare earth elements, how through the Belt and Road, they're building up these infrastructures in those countries in Central Asia. But this war has effectively pushed them to something that that Xi Jinping and former Ayatollah Khomeini never really considered, probably as a major method of shipping oil. And, it's far more efficient to send a tanker than it is to ship it by train. And there's an element too as of shadow fleets. That more than 90% of Iranian oil is sent via shadow fleets to China. China is their number one buyer, and part of the reason is because there's a discount on it. Sanctioned crude oil and sanctioned gas voids the premium that it takes to sell and price in USD, meaning they can offer wholesale prices. Iran effectively sets the price for their oil. But this is all, I mean, this whole thing now raises a further question. I'm just where this brings me next is the sheer irony, about OPEC and the UAE, going back to the UAE. The UAE had left OPEC, and one of the key things that brought about this was before the UAE left, there was Venezuela. Venezuela was effectively, after the U.S. extradited, brought Maduro back to the U.S. They then virtually overnight, within a few weeks, they doubled the Venezuelan output of heavy crude. And the response from OPEC, if you read the response from OPEC was effectively, there's nothing we can do. We're not going to kick them out. They have 303 billion barrels of reserves. They're the largest holder of reserves. Iran, funny enough, is number two. Canada is only at number four. I believe Iran's at number two. Again, more fundamentally, the U.S. effectively asserted control through U.S. companies, corporations over Venezuelan oil. And So that was the beginning. You begin to see the hairline fractures in OPEC and OPEC plus. Venezuela being a founding member, that's a time with the largest oil reserves in the world. That hits for that's a tough blow to OPEC. Whether and I mean there's the systemic risk for that they face on that. That they have virtually no control over one of their biggest reserve holders. Now back to the UAE. The UAE for years, if you read the reports that come out of their their national oil company there, they were underproducing their capacity. There's a difference between what they're allowed to produce under OPEC rules and regulations versus what they can actually produce. Just to give some figures to that, there's about a 1.4 million barrel per day gap in production between what they're producing. So they're producing about 3.5 million barrels per day, and their capacity is almost 5 million barrels per day. So there's an approximate 1.4 million barrel per day gap. The gaps only widen, and it only seems to get wider and wider. And this is a combination of technological advancement. This is a combination of investment in industry. To put it in the words, the Minister of State at the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Saeed bin Mubarak al-Hajeri. And he emphasized that it's a dire circumstance for them, and it also provides an economic opportunity. They this the way they've allocated their resources, they've managed. There's a stark difference in the way the UAE chooses to govern their country, and it's all about the key word here is choose. There's for those of you unfamiliar with understanding why the UAE does what it does and pulling apart, trying to understand, you kind of got to look at it from the perspective of understanding how the Arab world operates. You have the Sunnis and the Shiites. And I say this not to lump in baskets, but Iran is effectively the leader of the Shiite world versus whereas Saudi Arabia is the de facto leader of the Muslim Sunni world. And you see a stark difference in the way the Shia Muslim countries operate as opposed to the Sunni Muslim countries. A lot of the Sunni Muslim countries um, tend to invest a lot in AI, invest a lot in infrastructure, growing their critical mineral development. That Saudi Arabia, in particular, is looking to actively diversify into rare earth elements that they have themselves on their own within their own borders, and they also invested billions in the U.S. The UAE as well has invested billions in Canada and the U.S. And it goes to show, again, in the Minister of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that I mentioned before, his name, he had effectively said this is their choosing to they chose to invest in the energy sector and develop this technology to produce more efficiently, yet they have to hold back production to meet so they stay within certain quotas. Now, I want to shift focus a bit and talk a little bit about Canada. I was at a town hall the other week and was listening to my MP. There's a stark difference between the conservative and the liberal parties' approach to the energy sector. But I will say that I'm surprised, and I say this with from a nonpartisan standpoint, that Mark Carney under a liberal banner, yet he seems to be going around to other provinces and to try and stir up the energy sector. The energy sector has become such a touchy subject in Canada, specifically because of Alberta. They're effectively our de facto leader in terms of energy production in Canada, traditional energy production, I should say. And for years they've been held back from due to regulation. For those of you unfamiliar, there was Bill C-69. And I want to highlight too on Bill C-69, there is a bit of misunderstanding I find on both sides, both the conservatives and the liberals. A lot of people don't actually know. Read the bill. I would encourage, if you're listening to this and you haven't, and you have an opinion, and you think you have an opinion on Bill C-69, but you haven't read Bill C-69, go and skim the executive summary, and you'll see. I say this not to in favor of Bill C-69 or not against Bill C-69, but in But to kind of give a synopsis, it's effectively saying that, we're not blocking. It doesn't actually block. The narrative we see is that it blocks. And this is the very clever thing. I'll give Carney this. He's very clever at this. He's effectively blocked. He blocked the energy sector without blocking the energy sector. The liberals have managed to do this, and I say that, and what that means is you don't have to say outright no to oil. You can just slap as much regulation as possible. And the reason I meant, and this goes back to my town hall, the reason I mentioned that, I asked the question to my MP, and I asked him in the town hall. I said, can the EU is trying to divert from natural gas. The US has tariffs on many of these European countries. Many countries world globally, again, Canada has tariffs the US has tariffs on Canada. Now, isn't that a no-brainer then? We're already selling LNG Japan and Korea and South Korea. It should be a no-brainer. We should be selling our natural gas to our LNG to Europe. And more than so, we should be building. Again, we had a terminal out in Halifax, and it got cut for funding and some other red tape. It ran out the clock. But again, we had the TMX gas pipeline, but there needs to be another pipeline. It's a no-brainer. If we built a crude pipeline coast to coast, and we built another LNG terminal out east, we could be a global leader in production of both natural gas and LNG and crude oil. It comes into the question of, clean energy. So there was a study that carbon pricing, and all these green, I would dub them as green taxes on energy, would raise the cost per barrel by about 9 to 50 cents per barrel, and that's if carbon credits reach $130 per ton under the current Alberta Ottawa MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. Uh, just quickly, Memorandum of Understanding was effectively an agreement signed by Danielle Smith and Mark Carney. The criticism behind it was that she's effectively handcuffed herself, but it's basically Carney said, yes, of course, we'll help you develop your energy sector and build your pipeline, whatever you want, with conditions. And a lot of these conditions is the caveat, which again comes back to this carbon tax, sorry, not carbon tax. It comes back to this green tax, so to speak, where everything gets inflated because there was a different process. And this goes back to the root of Bill C-69. The MOU effectively allowed Carney to implement Bill C-69 in a different way. It effectively means that in order to produce energy, you have to pay attention to, indigenous communities, and you have to work with indigenous communities. You have to work with social development in the region, in the community. So if you build a pipeline through a community, you have to work with the community and get their approval you have to get their permission to go through their community. You have to work with them, but also green, clean environments. So ESG requirements and all these things. And this goes back to Ottawa's push to meet their Paris agreements. Mind you, we are behind. Someone at the what's kind of funny is someone someone from my riding as well stood up and said as well, kind of commented on this. And what's funny is they came out as a supporter of this MP, but also on the flip side said they believe the Paris Agreement is critical for Canada. Uh, but at the same time, we're behind. We're well behind what our annual target should be to meet the Paris agreements. For those of you, again, the Paris Agreement is an agreement signed in Paris by a bunch of Western nations to effectively reach net zero and carbon emissions. Uh, that's a discussion for another day. I mean, I have a lot of opinions on whether that's actually attainable. Um, I mean, geographically and also demographically, and also and also when you look at carbon emissions from other countries around the globe. But I won't get into that today. If you like this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, turn your notifications on so you never miss one. I hope you enjoyed it. See you guys next